Okay, guys, in the last lesson, we were talking about the Enlightenment and all of the things that went along with it. And we know what the Enlightenment is now. We know that the Enlightenment uh, was a movement that is really going to occur in the 17th and 18th century. We also realize that it is going to be when a lot of these philosophers, philosophies, which we just finished talking about, are going to use the scientific method and its rules and try to apply them to society as well. So when we're looking at this next lesson, we're looking at actually standard or indicator 5.2, which is about analyzing the ideas of social equality, democracy, constitutionalism, and nationalism brought about by the Enlightenment and their effects on institutions. So now we're going to look at how the Enlightenment is going to influence the rulers of Europe, and we're going to delve into that quite a bit in this next lesson. The first thing we're going to know is we're going to learn how these ideas had an impact on art, music, literature, and politics during the 18th century. And then, of course, some of the world's greatest musical composers are going to live during this period. So with that being said, let's look at our learning objectives. These are the things that you should be able to answer once you're through with this video lecture. Describe the arts of the Enlightenment period. Explain enlightened absolutism and its rulers. Describe the War of Austrian Succession, and describe the 7 Years' War. So you should be able to answer those four basic questions. Make sure that you jot these down. You can go back and answer them after watching the video lecture. Some of the key vocabulary, two big ones here. The word Rococo was an artistic style in the 18th century that emphasized grace, charm, and gentle action, and we're going to be looking at some of that. And then the word enlightened absolutism. This is a type of monarchy, and remember, a monarchy is a king or queen, in which rulers tried to govern by Enlightenment principles while maintaining their royal powers. And we're going to look at who some of those enlightened rulers might have been. So, with that being said, let's look at the arts first, okay? So during the 18th century, there's going to be important achievements that were going to be made in architecture, art, music, and literature. After Louis XIV builds his palace at Versailles, which you see pictured here on the far right-hand corner. Once he builds this palace of Versailles in the 17th century, there's going to be other European rulers who are going to begin to build elaborate palaces like Versailles. Most of these palaces were modeled after the Italian Baroque style of the 15 and 1600s. One of the greatest architects during this period of the 18th century was a guy named Balthasar Neumann. His two masterpieces are the Church of the 14 Saints in southern Germany and the Residence, and also the Palace of the Prince Bishop of Würzburg. Now, I do not have his name up there, but I would like for you to write his name down, and you can just put his last name. His last name is spelled Neumann, and he was a famous architect during this period. And of course, I just mentioned some of the places that he was known for: the Church of the 14 Saints in southern Germany, and the Palace of Prince Bishop of Würzburg. Würzburg is Wurzburg. So if you want to write those down, you can. With that, let's keep moving on, and let's talk about the Baroque and the neoclassical styles are going to continue in the 18th century. But by the 1730s, however, a new artistic style is going to start to spread all over Europe. It is known as Rococo, and I've got a picture of some Rococo art over here on the right-hand side, which you see this picture. Rococo is going to emphasize grace, charm, and gentle action. It is made up of using really delicate designs that have graceful curves in them. It has lightness and charm, which speaks of the pursuit of happiness, pleasure, and love. One of the most famous of the Rococo painters was a guy named Antoine Watteau. and you don't have to know his name, but he is one of the famous ones. In his paintings, upper class men and women are often depicted in a world of pleasure and joy. Another aspect of Rococo, though, was a sense of enchantment and enthusiasm. So you saw that often featured in Rococo. Um, and again, if you look at this art, you can see on the right-hand side, this is sort of a really good indicator of what Rococo art was about. The main thing you need to know was that, again, it emphasized grace, charm, and gentle action, and it was done during this period um, in the 1730s or in the 18th century. But again, one of the most famous art styles used during this period. The 18th century was also one of the greatest periods in the history of European music. Um, and of course, there are a few of these guys that you see pictured here that we're going to talk about. Mozart, Bach, Handel, and Haydn were all famous composers during this period. Johann Sebastian Bach and George Frederick Handel were two musical geniuses that lived during this period. They're going to compose music during the first half of the 18th century. They perfected the Baroque musical style. And during the second half of the century, we're going to see two other guys come about, and that is going to be Franz Joseph Haydn, which you see pictured on the slide, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. They would write music as well, and their music would be referred to as classical. So again, you had Bach and Handel who are going to write in the Baroque music style, and you're going to have Haydn and Amadeus Mozart who are going to write in the classical style. The 18th century was also important in the development of the European novel. So there was a lot of books and things that are going to come out. Um, these novels are going to talk about morals and how to survive. And of course, we're going to see some changes in the way people write books during this period as well. So, again, this is about the arts. Make sure you know the guys that we got listed here: Louis XIV, who built the Palace of Versailles. If you don't know how to spell these things, they're over here on the left-hand side. And then, of course, you need to know the difference with the Baroque and the Rococo. Baroque was a style that was used early on. Rococo is going to be the one that's going to replace it. And then, of course, the four musical geniuses, Bach, Handel, Haydn, and Mozart, all lived during this Enlightenment period of the 18th century. So, our first question, after listening to this, you should be able to answer: what four musical geniuses lived during the 18th century? Pause the video, write the question down, and then record your answer. Moving on, let's look at Enlightenment and Enlightened absolutism. So the philosophies who we've talked about in the last lesson believed in natural rights for all people. These rights included equality before the law, freedom of religious worship, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and the right to assemble, hold property, and pursue happiness. Those were their basic beliefs, these philosophies of the Enlightenment period. But most of these philosophies are going to believe that people needed to be governed by enlightened rulers. Enlightened rulers allow religious toleration, freedom of speech and of press, and the rights of private property. So that's what an enlightened ruler is. They promoted arts, sciences, and education. But above all, they obey the laws and enforce them fairly for all people. Many historians are going to assume that a new type of monarchy is going to emerge in the 18th century, which they called enlightened absolutism. And what enlightened absolutism is it's a system where the rulers tried to govern by using Enlightenment principles while maintaining their royal powers. So we've talked about enlightened rulers, we've talked about enlightened absolutism, which you see over here on the left. So they're basically going to try to apply these enlightened principles, which we just talked about: freedom of press, freedom of speech, and so on, and right to property. And they're going to try to apply these things into how they actually ruled their people or ruled over their people. This idea, though, has been called into question. One of the major rulers in Europe in the 18th century, which is only going to be Joseph II of Austria, made truly radical changes based on Enlightenment ideas. So Joseph II, which you see pictured here, is going to actually use some of these Enlightened ideas in order to apply them to his rule. He's going to make these radical changes, but most rulers were guided primarily by a concern for power and well-being of their state. So Joseph II is probably the one that's going to use these Enlightenment ideas the most of all of these guys that we're going to be discussing. He was from Austria, so you definitely need to know that Joseph II was from Austria. There's another country out there called Prussia. Prussia eventually becomes Germany, but there are going to be two Prussian kings, which we're going to discuss, and that's going to be Frederick William I and Frederick II, which you see pictured on the slide. Frederick William I and Frederick William II. Anyway, they're going to make Prussia a major European power in the 18th century. So Prussia is going to prosper during this period. Frederick William I is going to try to maintain a highly efficient bureaucracy of civil service workers. And if you don't know what bureaucracy is, it's basically all the government policies and all those things put together. And then civil service workers are people who were working for the government. He also doubled the size of the army, and because of its size and its reputation as one of the best armies in Europe, this army became an important institution in Prussia. Frederick II, who's also referred to as Frederick the Great, was a really cultured guy, very well educated. He was well informed about the ideas of the Enlightenment. He too is going to enlarge the Prussian army during this period. He's going to keep a strict watch over the bureaucracy, which is basically the government and all of the things that go along with it. And he is going to make some enlightened reforms. A couple of those things that he's going to do is he's going to abolish the use of torture, except in treason and murder cases. And remember, we talked about Beccaria in the last lesson, so he's sort of using those ideas. He's going to he's going to limit the freedom of speech and press and greater religious toleration. So he's going to grant limited freedom of speech and press, which is going to allow them, people to be able to speak out, the press to be able to publish some of the things that they want. And then he's also going to allow for certain religions to be able to carry on. And he's not saying, look, there's only going to be one religion in Prussia. So he's allowing religious toleration. Toleration is, again, being able to, exactly what it says, tolerate. However, he did not abolish serfdom or the rigid social structure in Prussia. Serfdom, people were tied to the land. They were sort of forced to work the land. They're not slaves, but they're pretty much hooked to the land for the most part. And but they could gain their freedom and eventually buy their own land. But not getting rid of serfdom was a big deal. And of course, the social structure in Prussia was very rigid, meaning that they didn't change. It was mainly made up of the aristocrats and pretty much everybody else. So that's it for Prussia. Let's keep going on and let's look at Austria. And we just talked about Joseph II, but let's keep going and talk about some other rulers in Austria. By the beginning of the 18th century, the Austrian Empire had become one of the great European states. Austria, just below Germany, if you were looking on a map. It was difficult to rule Austria because it was made up of many different nationalities, languages, religions, and cultures. So you had a bunch of different people that were living there. A leader that's going to come to power is going to be Maria Theresa. which you see over here on the left. Maria Theresa is going to take over in 1740, and she's going to work to centralize the Austrian Empire and strengthen the power of the state. So she's going to try to make it a lot stronger. Her successor was going to be Joseph II, and he was determined to make changes. And again, we talked about him a few minutes ago, but he's going to abolish serfdom, eliminate the death penalty, and establish the principle of equality of all before law, and enacted religious reforms. So Joseph II, this guy, is going to be the one who's going to bring those Enlightenment ideas to Austria. He made the nobles, or the people that had a lot of money in Austria, very upset when he freed the serfs. The Catholic Church, which we know is still around, was really unhappy with his religious reforms. And even the serfs were unhappy, the ones that he freed, because they were confused by the drastic changes in his policy. So Joseph II did try to make some of these Enlightenment reforms and apply those Enlightenment principles. In Russia, and we talked about Russia, we talked about Prussia, we've talked about Austria. Now let's look at Russia, and we're going to look at Peter the Great, which you see here in the middle. Peter the Great was followed by 6 weak czars. After the last of the 6 czars, Peter III, was murdered, his German wife became the ruler of Russia, and that lady is going to be Catherine the Great, which you see here on the far right. Catherine is going to rule over Russia from 1762 to 1796. Catherine was an intelligent woman. She was familiar with the works of the philosophies, but she's a little afraid to try to apply some of those things. She thought many of their ideas were impractical. She did consider the idea of a new law code that would recognize the equality of all people. But in the end, Catherine sort of backs down because she knew that if she started trying to apply these Enlightenment ideas, that she would possibly lose the support of the Russian nobility. And she couldn't afford to do that. Her policies are going to lead to worse conditions for Russian peasants and eventually to a rebellion. That rebellion is going to spread across all of Russia, mainly in the south, but soon after it would collapse. Catherine would have to use strong measures against the peasants after this rebellion, and all rural reform was halted and serfdom was expanded into newer parts of the empire. But under Catherine, Russia spread southward to the Black Sea. To the west, Russia gained about 50% of Poland's territory. So Catherine the Great sort of launches back at these serfs and peasants in sort of a cruel and brutal way. So that's it for these Enlightenment and Enlightened absolutism people. Let's look at rulers. Let's look at our question for this slide. What European ruler made major changes based on Enlightenment ideas? Let's pause the video and take a minute to write your question down and then record your answer. Moving on, let's talk about the War of Austrian Succession. So we've talked about these enlightened rulers and enlightened absolutism, and now we're going to see some wars that are going to occur during this period. In 1740, a major war is going to break out in connection with the succession to the Austrian throne. When the Austrian Emperor Charles VI dies, he was succeeded by his daughter Maria Theresa, who we just talked about. Many people were going to view Maria Theresa as being weak, one of them being a guy named King Frederick II, which we just discussed a few minutes ago, of Prussia. He thinks he can take advantage of the situation in Austria. And so he decides to take the Prussian army and invade a place known as Silesia. So when he invades Silesia, it's going to cause France to enter in the war against Austria as well. And of course, France had been Austria's traditional enemy. They had been enemies all along. Maria Theresa knows she needs an alliance, so she's going to make an alliance with Great Britain. So you have Prussia and France against Austria and Great Britain. The War of Austrian Succession was fought in three parts of the world. You want to write these down. In Europe, Prussia is going to seize Silesia, which we just said, and France is going to occupy the Austrian Netherlands. In the Far East, France is going to take a place known as the Madras in India from the British. And in North America, the British are going to capture the French fortress of Louisbourg at the entrance of the St. Lawrence River. So here are these three parts of the world where all of this stuff is taking place. Make sure you know who's fighting against who, which I've listed at the top: Austria and Britain versus Prussia and France. After the 7 Years' War, all of the parties were exhausted and agreed to a treaty that's pretty much going to put an end to all of this, called the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. This treaty is going to return all the occupied territories except Silesia, who Prussia invaded, to their original owners. Prussia's refusal to return Silesia is going to mean another war between Prussia and Austria, and we're going to talk about that. So let's look at our question for this slide, and that's going to be: in what three parts of the world was the War of Austrian Succession fought? Pause the video, write your question down, and then record your answer. Moving on, let's look at the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War and the Austrian War of Succession sort of combine themselves. 7 Years' War is often looked at as one of the world's first world wars because you had so many places that were involved. You had a couple of different continents involved, and you're going to see these countries once again square off. But this time in the 7 Years' War, you're going to have some different alliances. Britain and Prussia are going to go to war. Remember, it was France and Prussia in the last one, versus Austria, France, and Russia. The 7 Years' War is going to be fought in Europe, India, and North America. Maria Theresa is going to refuse to accept the loss of Silesia, which we just discussed. Remember, Prussia invaded and then kept Silesia. So she's going to rebuild her army and work to separate Prussia from its chief ally, France. The French-Austrian rivalry had been a fact of life in Europe since the late 16th century. So they've been fighting for a while. However, two of those new rivalries are now replaced the old one: the rivalry of Britain and France over colonial empires, and the rivalry of Austria and Prussia over Silesia. France is going to abandon Prussia, and they are going to ally with Austria. Russia is going to join the new alliance with France and Austria. So you see, these alliances have sort of switched up in the 7 Years' War versus what they were in the War of Austrian Succession. In turn, Britain is going to ally itself with Prussia. This diplomatic revolution is going to lead to another worldwide war, which I just told you. The war had three major areas of conflict. It's going to be fought in Europe, India, and North America. Make sure that you know that. There were now two major alliances in Europe: the British and Prussians against the Austrians, Russians, and French. So that is going to be the alliances during the 7 Years' War. Frederick the Great of Prussia was easily able to defeat the Austrian, French, and Russian armies for a time. But however, his forces are going to eventually start to wear down, and he's going to realize he's got to do something. He faced disaster until Peter III, who's a new Russian czar, is going to withdraw his Russian troops from the conflict. So Russia's really going to get out of this. And this withdrawal is going to create a stalemate and lead to a desire for peace. The European War, or in the 7 Years' War, would actually come to an end in 1763 as peace is finally agreed upon. All the occupied territories will return to their original owners, and Austria officially recognized Prussia's control of Silesia. So even though Silesia was a big part of this, Prussia's still going to keep that land after the 7 Years' War is over with too. So Prussia still ends up with Silesia. The struggle, though, between Britain and France and the rest of the world had more decisive results. And of course, they referred to this war as the Great War for Empire. And it was mainly fought in India and North America. In North America, we refer to this war as the French and Indian War. The British are going to ultimately win out in India, and the Treaty of Paris would be signed, ending the hostilities between France and Great Britain. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 would end the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War in North America. Again, by far the greatest conflicts of the 7 Years' War is going to take place in North America. Remember the French, for you guys that can remember that France had controlled and started some colonies in North America, mainly in Canada, and they mainly controlled the middle portions of the United States, all the way from Canada to Louisiana. It was valuable to the French for its fur, leather, fish, and timber. British North America at this time consisted of the 13 colonies on the eastern coast, which you guys know about or should know about. The British and French are going to fight over two primary areas in North America. One of them was the waterway at the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which comes in Canada, and eventually into the Great Lakes. The other was going to be the Ohio River Valley. The French began to establish forts along the Ohio River Valley. This is going to threaten the ability of the British settlers who were living in the United States at that point, or living in the 13 colonies at that point, from trying to expand into this area. So British settlers weren't able to move around very much because the French were occupying that area. The French were able to gain the support of the Indians, which again, why we call it the French and Indian War. Make sure that you know that too. The reason why the Indians would side with the French, because the French were more traders and they were not looking to take their land. They only wanted to trap and hunt for the most part. At first, the French are going to have a number of victories, and the French had more troops in North America than the British, but unfortunately for the French, they did not have a lot of naval support. So the French Navy was not really there to help them out much. The defeat of the French fleets in major naval battles is going to give the British a very strong advantage, which Britain has the strongest navy in the world during this period. A series of British victories are going to soon follow. In 1759, British forces are going to defeat the French on the Plains of Abraham, just outside of Quebec in Canada. You don't know where that is. And the British are going to go on to seize Montreal, the Great Lakes area, and eventually the Ohio River Valley. Once the British were able to conquer those territories, the French are going to be forced to make peace. And by the Treaty of Paris that the French and the British are going to sign with their European ally or with their European foes, it's going to end up transferring some land. And of course, Great Britain would win out. And by this time, Great Britain had become one of the world's greatest colonial powers after the 7 Years' War. So let's look at this last question. Where did the greatest conflicts of the 7 Years' War take place? Pause the video, write your question down, and then answer the question. That's going to do it for Impact of the Enlightenment. Please take very good notes. Go back and look at your learning objective questions and make sure that you have written those down and make sure that you can answer them. And that will do it. We're going to pick up with the next lesson, which is going to be colonial empires and the American Revolution, which some of this stuff should sound very familiar to us. And I will catch you guys on the next one.